The year is 1923, and a dangerous new force is sweeping through America. It's causing people to act strangely. It's making children misbehave. It's causing young women to scandalously flash their ankles. That's right, it's jazz. The Roaring Twenties were a time of excess. The stock markets were booming, the speakeasies were buzzing, and the flappers were flapping. But beneath the glittery surface, America was far from stable. While young people danced away in underground speakeasies, a more sinister force was quietly gaining traction in America, the Ku Klux Klan. At the helm of this white nationalist movement was a man who would become so powerful that he would control entire branches of his state's government. A man whose eventual downfall also brought down the entire KKK. And most surprisingly, his downfall came not from politics, but from a court case that revealed him to be a cannibal. This is a story of opposing forces, a clash between modernity and tradition, between the free-spirited energy of the Jazz Age and the entrenched bigotry of the Klan, both rooted in the American South, both spreading north, and both tearing the country in opposite directions. So join me as we explore this strange time in American history that honestly has a lot of parallels to America today, this time on Painting the Past. So as I began to think about what I could paint while I tell this story, it occurred to me that I'm talking about jazz and the KKK, and one of those things is probably not the best subject to paint. So because this is a story about a cultural war for the soul of America that was taking place between the Jazz Age, jazz music, and the KKK, I want to come up with a composition that really summarizes the feelings associated with that. In our story, we'll find out that Louis Armstrong was in a small wooden shack of a recording studio deep within the heart of the Klan. I want to paint that moment, and I want to convey some of the emotion around what he might have been feeling with his isolation and the intimidation from the Klan around him. So to get this composition right, I want to think of a few things. First of all, I want Louis Armstrong right in the middle. And it's going to be a dark, dimly lit recording studio, so I'm going to want a light above him shining down. And I want to convey this sense of isolation, like he's really on his own. And the darkness, I hope, creates this kind of intensity and this sort of unsettling feeling that he was probably feeling in that moment. So to start, I'm going to do that, and then I'm thinking about a couple rules of composition that can help the eye be guided around the painting, just to make it a little more visually pleasing. One of those rules is the rule of perspective that says that you can use leading lines to guide the eye to the subject. So I'm going to have some recording technology in the foreground that's essentially pointing the eye towards Louis Armstrong. I'll have some faders and some knobs and whatever, I'll look at some historical references of what they were using to record back then and try to get something that points the eye towards him. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to consider the golden ratio, which is a really interesting naturally occurring phenomenon that follows the Fibonacci sequence. And essentially, in context of composition, it is a rule that says that the human eye tends to look at paintings starting at the subject and spinning out in a sort of spiral pattern. And so I'm going to place strategically placed objects and interesting pieces of information in this painting in a pattern that'll help guide the eye in that spiral. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to have Louis Armstrong right in the middle with the light shining on him. And then the first thing you're going to see to the right in the foreground and cast deep in shadow is a large, daunting man. Maybe he's a recording engineer, maybe he's someone there that was watching. I want him to have this kind of looming presence, which is probably something that Louis Armstrong felt in this recording studio when he was surrounded by Klansmen. Again, we're going to get to that story in a second. So I'm going to have him cast in the shadow. I want this sort of unsettling feeling. From there, I'm going to use recording technology to guide the eye around the painting, and then have a sort of like a recording shelf on the side, all of which are going to lead the eye back to the subject, which is Louis playing his cornet. So to start, I'm using two colors and two colors only, burnt umber and ultramarine blue. And I'm just going to do a very light wash. The whole course of this painting, because it's going to be dark, is going to be me building up layer after layer of dark wash. And the only place I'm going to leave light is that light and the beam of light shining down on Louis Armstrong. So let's see how this goes. And let's get back to the story. The American Civil War ended in 1865, and it officially marked the end of slavery. Suddenly, 36% of America's population now walked free. So these freed slaves were given land as reparations, and much of the land that they were given was previously owned by 70,000 white plantation owners. But the offer didn't last long. President Andrew Johnson took office 1 year after the Civil War ended, and to put it bluntly, he was very racist. He revoked the order and returned the land to its former white owners, saying, "This is a country for white men, and as long as I'm president, it shall be a government for white men." It was clear that even though the war had ended, the battle for equality was just starting. As Walt Whitman said, the task of peace would prove to be more difficult than the war itself. See, after the war, Southern white plantation owners were angry. They were bitter. Their businesses were taken away from them, their values were degraded, and they felt betrayed by their own government. And so one day, in 1866, a few Southern veterans met in a dark basement and formed a social club designed to promote the traditions of a past era when slavery was legal and all was well in the world. They called this club the Ku Klux Klan, a spin on the Greek word kuklos, meaning circle. I presume that's because they would sit in a cute little circle at their meetings. It didn't take long for this social club to grow, and it quickly evolved into a violent organization that was committed to fighting Reconstruction at all costs. In just 2 years, there were 40,000 members in Tennessee alone, where it was founded, and 500,000 members across the South. Violence against black communities escalated, and the Klan's influence seeped into politics, gaining traction across Southern states. The movement had caught a spark, and the fire was growing. But all of this momentum came to a halt in 1871 when President Grant signed the Ku Klux Klan Act. See, Grant was a Union general who hated the Klan. Upon taking office, he swiftly arrested 3,000 Klansmen, giving many of them disproportionately long prison sentences as a signal to Klan members around the country. He declared martial law in places and cracked down hard. His efforts paid off, and the Klan started to disband. As quickly as the movement caught fire, it died out. Around this time, the African-American activist Frederick Douglass said, "The slaughter of our people has so far ceased." So far. From there, things were fairly quiet. America was going through a period of immense change. Over the next 50 years, the US shifted from a rural agrarian society to an urban industrial power. Rapid immigration, technological advances, and the railroad fueled economic growth. The Progressive Era brought social and political reforms, like women's voting rights. By the time the 1920s had ushered in, America was a global superpower with a thriving economy. A sense of freedom and prosperity was sweeping the nation, and for many, including black people and immigrants, this felt like an era of opportunity. But bubbling beneath this optimism was something much more sinister. In a small town in Indiana, a little-known man named D.C. Stephenson was resurrecting a hateful social club that was around some 50 years before. Under Stephenson, this social club would soon twist into a gruesome domestic terror organization responsible for thousands of murders across the country. At its peak, it would be a movement some 5 million people strong, and the movement would only die out when its leader was embroiled in a public court case that outed him as, among other things, a cannibal. But let's step away from the darkness of the Klan and turn to something far more uplifting: jazz. Jazz wasn't so much invented as it was a natural evolution of sound, first heard in the lively streets of New Orleans. At the time, the city was a cultural crossroads, blending French, Mexican, and Caribbean influences with deep African musical traditions brought by enslaved people. From this rich fusion of cultures, jazz was born. It was upbeat, it was provocative, and it was liberating. And it wasn't just music, it was a whole movement. See, jazz was ushering in a cultural era known as the Jazz Age. As it spread north from New Orleans, the music became a symbol of modernity, a soundtrack to young love and freedom, and a break from the old, rigid structures of society. Now, this cultural movement had been simmering beneath the surface, but the spark that set it ablaze was prohibition. In 1920, the US government passed the 18th Amendment banning the sale, production, and transportation of alcohol in an attempt to curb crime and what they saw as moral decay. Not surprisingly, many of the people who supported this were the same that supported the Klan. But instead of repressing the energetic youth, prohibition fueled an explosion of underground nightlife. Speakeasies sprang up on every corner, transforming into hidden hubs of music, defiance, and dancing, where jazz provided the soundtrack to the rebellion. In these secret spaces, racial barriers were torn down, old traditions crumbled, and a new era of cultural expression took hold. Not surprisingly, this new world was deeply concerning to the lineage of Confederate plantation owners of days past. To these conservative-minded folk, jazz was just another sign that the fabric of society was unraveling, that the government again was undermining their values they held dear. This clash between modernity and tradition set the stage for the turbulent and violent struggles of the 20s. And there's no way to talk about this turbulence and violence without telling you about D.C. Stephenson, the leader of the Klan, and one of the most messed up people in American history. Buckle up. So D.C. Stephenson wasn't just a leader of the Klan, he was its emperor. He was charismatic, he was cunning, and he was deeply corrupt. In the early 1920s, the Klan had pretty much faded from public life, but Stephenson saw an opportunity. He knew that racism, nationalism, and a fear of social change still simmered beneath the surface of American society, and all he had to do was wake it up. And so, with ruthless ambition, he resurrected the Klan, not as a social club, but as a sophisticated political machine. He positioned the Klan as a defender of American values, tapping into the fear and anxiety of white people who feared the growing influence of immigrants, African Americans, and the cultural upheaval of the Jazz Age. In Indiana, he turned the Klan into a political juggernaut. At its peak, the Indiana Klan had 250,000 members. That's 1 in 3 white men in the state. Governors, senators, and law enforcement officials were all under his sway. Stephenson ran the state. He famously said, "I am the law in Indiana." And for a time, he was. He was a genius at growing the Klan. He created a propaganda machine through the KKK newspaper, The Fiery Cross. In one instance, he wrote, "We receive at our port of immigration an ignorant people who possess neither blood nor brain." To my American viewers, does that sound familiar? The fear and hatred went deeper. Georgia's governor, Clifford Walker, said at a Klan rally in 1924 that the U.S. should build a wall of steel, a wall as high as heaven, to keep immigrants out. His strategy was working, and people wanted in on his social club. To meet the demand, they created the Klan Women's Division, and for the little ones, they created the Ku Klux Kitties. Stephenson also took advantage of a little-known law written in the mid-1800s, which allowed everyday citizens to act as vigilantes against horse theft. He distorted this law to create a paramilitary wing used to enforce Klan dominance. In essence, it was a legal army owned and operated by the KKK. So Stephenson used this army to intimidate political rivals, silence opposition, and reinforce his power. The fever was so high that at one point an anti-Klan journalist published the confidential names of 10,000 Klansmen in Indiana, including high-profile politicians and local businessmen. But instead of outing these people as traitors and racists, the opposite happened. The public saw this as a sort of social club. They read the list to see who wasn't included. Many people felt left out of the club, and it actually drove more initiations. But nothing quite summed up Stephenson's and the Klan's dominance like their public shows of power, which came in the form of rallies held across the nation. In the small town of Kokomo, Indiana, they held a rally attended by 200,000 Klansmen. As far as Madison Square Garden in New York City, they held a rally with 30,000 Klansmen. These rallies were like massive festivals, and they were a signal to the whole country that these streets, these towns, these cities were all theirs. And it was at the heart of one of these very Klan rallies that in 1923, something very unlikely took place. In the town of Richmond, Indiana, in a tiny windowless wooden shack turned recording studio, a young man named Louis Armstrong blew a cornet so hard that it seemed to shake the earth, so free that the music felt as though it was pouring out of his own soul. The music he recorded there under the name King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band sold records all across the country and helped jazz cross racial barriers. That recording session took place on the same day as a massive Klan rally, the largest in that area of the Midwest. As Louis Armstrong and his band of half a dozen musicians stepped off the train from Chicago into Richmond, they must have thought that they'd landed in hell. The streets were teeming with hooded Klansmen, women, and little Ku Klux kiddos, celebrating the summer heat beneath their sheets. As the band weaved their way through the alleys to avoid the hooded figures, the drummer Baby Dodd said, "We were all very nervous. Perspiration as big as a thumb dropped off of us." So the studio that they eventually got to and recorded at was run by the Gennett brothers, who were born to Italian immigrant parents. And this studio was a crucial part of bringing jazz to the mainstream. As a music nerd myself, I plan to make an entire video about them because their story is actually incredible. But I love the irony that hidden deep within a crowd of angry Klansmen who claimed to be the heart and soul of America, a group of 6 African-American musicians and a couple of Italians were creating a very different soul of America, one that would symbolize freedom and equality over hate and prejudice. And now, let's get to the soul of our painting and finish this off. So as you can see, I've just been building up these dark layers, and I'm at a point now where I can start to get a little bit of detail in. I didn't really leave the details to the end like I normally do because there's really not much information, and I think that speaks to the fact that the composition itself is doing a lot of the speaking. So what I'm focusing on is just getting the mood now, darkening the man's suit, making sure that the walls in the recording studio are nice and dark, lifting a little bit of paint to get those light beams down, and then getting some of the knobs and some of the recording equipment to look a little bit realistic and lead to its Louis Armstrong. I'm also going to just touch up his face, which I've been kind of working on, and if you've watched previous videos, you know that faces are my nemesis, and I have zero expectations here, but so far I'm not totally opposed to it. So if you're painting along, I'd love to see what you do. I'm not giving a lot of instruction this time because it's pretty free form, but as always, please do share what you've painted with me if you painted. Now let's get back to the history. Arrogance has a way of leading men to their downfall, and Stephenson's came in spectacular fashion. While he was building his empire, Stephenson had developed a morbid habit of assaulting women. He'd done this time and time again, but none of his victims felt safe to speak up, a testament to the times they lived in and the power he had. In 1925, he kidnapped and assaulted a young woman named Madge Oberholzer. To spare you the details, all I will say is that she was so badly hurt by him that she didn't live long. But she did live long enough to tell her story on her deathbed, which explained in chilling detail how the man who claimed to uphold American morality was actually a sadistic predator. Her testimony was gruesome, and among more awful things, she had physical evidence that he actually took entire bites out of her. Those bites became infected and ultimately led to her death, but her brave testimony and the ensuing trial was a bombshell to the white public, many of whom saw the Klan and Stephenson as symbols of righteousness. As the gruesome details of his crimes were laid bare in court, his political allies, many of whom owed their entire careers to him, scrambled to distance themselves. So convicted of murder, he was sentenced to life in prison. And with Stephenson's fall, the Klan lost its grip on the American public. They were soured. Membership plummeted, politicians resigned in disgrace, and the organization collapsed under the weight of its own scandals. By the end of the decade, the Klan, once 5 million people strong, was a shadow of its former self. But the hate that it fueled never truly disappeared. It simply went dormant, waiting for another leader, another moment, another opportunity to rise again. Throughout history, fear and hate have risen up and washed over the fabric of humanity time and time again. It starts as a swell on the horizon, building until it crashes over us, leaving us tattered and scarred as it recedes into the distance. It's hard to predict when it will come back, but if you look closely at the past, you'll see the storm long before it arrives. And I wish that there was a storm to come and blow this painting out of my hands and into the trash, because I'm not happy with it. Okay, it's not that bad. But I'll just say a couple things. You know, I love the composition. I'm pretty proud of the fact that I was able to compose this. I think it naturally, with the light and the leading lines, it leads you to Louis Armstrong. Once again, I am defeated by my nemesis, the face. But it was a fun exercise, and I will say, I feel like I captured his expression fairly well. Maybe the proportions are a little bit off, and he looks a little bit like a teddy bear. But I think I got him kind of like blasting into that cornet, you know? So I'm pretty happy with that. I love the color scheme. You know, I think that the blues and the burnt sienna work really well here to give it almost feels like a sepia like photograph. And I really like how I've cast this guy in shadow. He feels intimidating. He feels somewhat daunting, and there's something just you don't fully know what the story is with him. So I'm pretty happy with that. I hope you painted along, and I hope you enjoyed this story. It's an incredibly important story and one we don't often learn about in America. We think about the 20s as this beautiful time of wealth and prosperity, but that wasn't true for everyone. And I hope this has helped sort of inform you on some of the stuff that was going on back then. So anyways, thanks as always for joining, and I will see you next time on Painting the Past.